It always begins with a question, a ringing phone, a familiar voice, a game you didn't agree to play. Before Scream, horror asked you to be afraid of the killer. After Scream, horror asked you to be afraid of what you already knew. Because in 1996, Scream didn't just bring slashers back from the dead. It held up a mirror and dared the audience to look. The characters knew the rules. They quoted the movies. They laughed at the cliches. And then they died anyway. Ghostface wasn't a monster. He wasn't supernatural. He slipped, he panicked, he bled. Scream turned horror into a conversation about movies, about fame, about violence, and about the strange comfort we find in watching it all repeat. Each sequel didn't just continue the story. It challenged the era that created it. Sequels that needed to go bigger. Remakes chasing nostalgia. Requels trapped between old fans and new ones. And every time the rules changed, Ghostface adapted, which meant anyone could be behind the mask. Because Scream was never really about the killer. It was about obsession, about audiences who know the ending and watch anyway. This is the story of Scream, a franchise that never rebooted its timeline, never stopped evolving, and never let the audience feel completely safe. Because the phone is still ringing. And somewhere, someone is about to answer. By the early 1990s, the slasher genre was running on empty. What once terrified audiences had become routine. The killers were predictable. The rules were stale. And the fear was gone. Franchises that once defined horror, Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, had been stretched in by sequels that followed the same formula. Audiences knew who would survive. They knew when the scare would happen. They knew the ending before the movie even began. And Hollywood noticed. Studios quietly moved away from slashers, labeling them outdated, juvenile, and unprofitable. Horror as a genre was pushed aside, replaced by thrillers, psychological dramas, and prestige crime films. But while the genre was fading on screen, something was changing in the real world. True crime was gaining attention. News coverage of violence became more graphic, and audiences were becoming more aware, not just of danger, but of how stories about danger were told. This shift would inspire a struggling screenwriter named Kevin Williamson. In the early 1990s, Williamson was living in a small apartment, watching news reports about a serial killer known as the Gainesville Ripper, later identified as Danny Rolling. What unsettled him wasn't just the violence. It was the idea that fear could enter a home without warning, through a window, through a door, through a phone call. Williamson began writing a script that didn't follow traditional horror rules. Instead, it questioned them. The script was titled Scary Movie. It wasn't a parody. It wasn't a comedy. It was a slasher that knew it was a slasher. Characters talked about horror movies. They recognized cliches. They understood the danger. And yet, they still couldn't escape it. Almost every major studio rejected the script. They didn't understand its tone. They thought it was too self-aware, too strange, too risky. But one person saw its potential. A director who had already reshaped horror once before. His name was Wes Craven. And with that decision, horror was about to remember how to scream again. By the mid-1990s, Wes Craven was no longer chasing the slasher genre. He had helped define it, with Last House on the Left, The Hills of Eyes, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Craven had already changed horror, but he believed the genre had become trapped by its own success. Slashers were no longer frightening. They were familiar. So when Kevin Williamson's script crossed his desk, Craven wasn't immediately convinced. It was too clever, too self-aware, too different. But the more he read, the more Craven realized something crucial. This script wasn't making fun of horror. It was challenging it. The characters knew the rules, and that knowledge didn't save them. It only made the danger more unsettling. Craven understood that fear had evolved, and Scream was ready to evolve with it. Craven signed on as director, bringing credibility to a script that many studios still didn't fully trust. The film was picked up by Miramax under the Dimension Films banner. Even the title became a debate. The original name, Scary Movie, felt misleading, too comedic, too light. The title was changed to Scream, inspired by the Michael Jackson song Craven, heard repeatedly during production. It was simple, aggressive, impossible to ignore. Casting was deliberate and deceptive. Drew Barrymore, the film's biggest star, was cast first. Audiences assumed she would be the lead. Instead, she asked to play the opening victim. Her death would shatter expectations and redefine horror openings forever. Neve Campbell was cast as Sidney Prescott, a final girl unlike any before her. She wasn't passive. She wasn't clueless. She fought back. Alongside her were Courtney Cox as Gail Weathers, a ruthless media figure; David Arquette as Dewey Riley, a well-meaning but vulnerable sheriff's deputy. Together, they grounded the film in realism, even as the story deconstructed horror itself. Then there was a mask. The now iconic Ghostface design wasn't created by the studio. It was discovered by accident during location scouting. A simple, unsettling face, neither human nor supernatural. Perfect, with its cast, its director, and its identity locked in. Scream was ready, not to revive horror, but to expose it. And once the cameras rolled, there was no going back. When Scream was released in December 1996, audiences weren't prepared for what it was actually doing. This wasn't a slasher pretending to be smart. It was a slasher that understood its own history and used that knowledge as a weapon. The characters didn't stumble into danger blindly. They recognized it. Nowhere was this clearer than in the rules. Delivered by horror-obsessed Randy Meeks, the film laid them out plainly. Never have sex. Never drink or do drugs. Never say, "I'll be right back." Rules that horror fans already knew, but had never heard spoken aloud inside the movie itself. Scream turned audience awareness into part of the narrative, and then it broke the rules anyway. Ghostface wasn't an unstoppable force. He was clumsy. He was human. He made mistakes. He slipped while chasing victims. He was injured, stabbed, punched, shot. This wasn't Michael Myers walking through bullets. This was fear grounded in reality. And that made it worse. The mask became iconic almost instantly. It concealed identity while exaggerating emotion, a frozen scream caught between horror and mockery. But Ghostface wasn't one person. Behind the mask were Billy Loomis and Stu Macker. Two killers, two motives, one plan. The reveal was shocking not because it was complicated, but because it was believable. Billy represented obsession and manipulation. Stu represented chaos and immaturity. Together, they turned murder into performance, and their motive wasn't supernatural evil. It was resentment, blame, and the influence of stories themselves. The final act flipped the slasher formula completely. The killers were unmasked. They bled. They panicked. They argued. The myth collapsed. And Sidney Prescott didn't survive by accident. She survived by fighting back. Scream was a critical and commercial success. It revived the genre studios had abandoned. It inspired a wave of self-aware horror. And it proved that audiences weren't tired of slashers. They were tired of being underestimated. Horror had found its voice again, and it sounded like a scream. After the success of Scream, a sequel was inevitable. But Scream II wasn't just a follow-up. It was a response. Released in 1997, barely a year after the original, the film arrived in a world where Scream had already changed horror. Audiences were smarter now, and the sequel knew it. This time, the rules were different. Sequels had to be bigger. The kills had to be more elaborate. The stakes had to be higher. And Scream II said all of it out loud. Set on a college campus, the film explored what happens after survival. Sidney Prescott wasn't healing. She was being watched. The media had turned trauma into entertainment, violence into spectacle, and Gail Weathers was still chasing the story, even if it meant reopening old wounds. Once again, Ghostface returned. But the fear wasn't about whether the killer would strike. It was about why. The reveal followed the franchise's growing pattern. Two killers, Mickey Altieri, obsessed with fame and violence, and Mrs. Loomis, driven by revenge for her son. The message was clear. Horror franchises don't just create sequels. They create consequences. Scream 2 understood something most sequels didn't. It wasn't trying to outdo the original. It was trying to confront it. The film was a box office success and proved Scream wasn't a one-time phenomenon. It was a franchise with something to say, and it wasn't done talking yet. By the time Scream III arrived in the year 2000, everything had changed. The slasher revival was in full swing, and Hollywood had noticed. So Scream did what it always did best. It turned the camera on itself. Scream III moved the story to Hollywood, following the production of Stab 3, a movie based on the murders we'd already seen. Reality and fiction collided, and the line between them disappeared. This time, the rules weren't about sequels. They were about trilogies. Everything had to go bigger. Everything had to be connected, and the past had to explain the present. For the first time in the franchise, there was only one Ghostface, Roman Bridger, a director hiding in plain sight. His motive tied the entire saga together, revealing a hidden chapter in Sidney Prescott's past. The killer wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing recognition. Behind the scenes, the film was shaped by its time. Concerns over real-world violence led to rewrites. The tone became lighter. The kills became less graphic. Some fans saw this as a step back. Others saw it as a necessary evolution. But Scream III did something important. It gave Sidney a choice, not just to survive, but to stop running. The film closed the original trilogy. The mask was put away. The door was left open. And for a moment, it felt like Scream had said its final word. But in horror, silence never lasts forever. 11 years after Scream III, the phone rang again. In 2011, Scream IV arrived in a very different world. Horror was back, but it wasn't original anymore. Everything was being remade. Hollywood wasn't interested in new ideas. It wanted familiar names, familiar masks, familiar stories, and Scream IV knew exactly what that meant. This time, the rules weren't about trilogies. They were about remakes. The story returned to Woodsboro, blending old survivors with a new generation raised on social media, instant fame, and constant documentation. Everyone was filming. Everyone wanted attention. And someone wanted to be remembered. The killer reveal flipped the franchise on its head. Jill Roberts, Sidney's own cousin, didn't want to survive. She wanted to be famous. In a world obsessed with viral moments, being a victim was more powerful than being a hero. Jill wasn't running from horror. She was branding it. Her plan wasn't about revenge. It was about relevance. Scream IV became Wes Craven's final film, and in many ways, it felt like a warning about the cost of attention, about the danger of wanting an audience at any price. In 2015, horror lost one of its most important voices. Wes Craven passed away, leaving behind a legacy that shaped generations of fear. For Scream, the question wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Could the franchise continue without the man who understood it better than anyone else? For years, the answer seemed to be no. The mask stayed silent. The phone stopped ringing. And many believed Scream had ended exactly where it should have. But horror never stays buried. A new generation had grown up watching Scream, analyzing it, quoting it, and the world they lived in was even more self-aware than before. Social media had turned fandom into identity, criticism into performance, and nostalgia into currency. Eventually, the franchise returned, not with a reboot, but with something more dangerous, a continuation. New directors took the helm. New characters entered the story. But one rule remained unchanged. Everything that happened before still mattered. The challenge wasn't honoring Wes Craven. It was understanding why his films worked in the first place. Because Scream was never just about who wore the mask. It was about timing, perspective, and knowing when the audience thought they were ahead of the movie. The next chapter wouldn't just bring Ghostface back. It would test whether Scream could still cut deep in a world that thought it had already seen everything. In 2022, Scream returned, not as a remake, not as a reboot, but as something Hollywood had just learned how to name, a requel. This new Scream honored the past while targeting the present. It brought back legacy characters, Sidney Prescott, Gale Weathers, and Dewey Riley, while introducing a new generation shaped by fandom, online discourse, and obsession. The rules had changed again. This time, the commentary wasn't about sequels or remakes. Ghostface's motive was a revenge. It was disappointment. Richie and Amber wanted to fix Stab by creating real-life inspiration. They weren't victims of trauma. They were critics with knives. It was about toxic fandom. Fans who didn't just love a franchise, they believed they owned it. For the first time, Scream said it out loud. Sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who hate a movie. They're the ones who love it too much. The film made one devastating choice. Dewey Riley died, a legacy character, a symbol of survival, gone. His death wasn't shock for shock's sake. It was a statement. The past could no longer protect the present. Scream had survived without Wes Craven, but it hadn't softened. It had sharpened. By the time Scream VI arrived in 2023, the franchise made one thing clear. The rules were gone. No town was safe. No legacy was guaranteed. And survival was no longer a promise. For the first time in the series, the story left Woodsboro behind. New York City became the setting, crowded, loud, and unforgiving. If Ghostface could strike here, he could strike anywhere. This time, Sidney Prescott was absent. For the first time in the franchise's history, the story moved forward without its original final girl. The spotlight shifted to Sam and Tara Carpenter, survivors trying to outrun a past that refused to let go. The Ghostface attacks were faster, more brutal, and more public. Subways, bodegas, apartment buildings. There was no privacy left. The reveal followed a twisted evolution. Not one killer, not two, but a family. Detective Wayne Bailey and his children, driven by revenge for Richie. This wasn't obsession with movies. It was obsession with blood. Scream VI pushed the franchise into new territory. Higher body counts, relentless pacing, and a sense that Ghostface was no longer playing games. Most importantly, Scream VI proved something crucial. Scream could survive without Sidney Prescott. The mask didn't belong to one story anymore. It belonged to the world. And with that realization, the door opened for the next chapter. Scream VII was announced as the next chapter in the franchise, and with it came a shift that surprised longtime fans. For the first time since the original film, the creator came back in a new role. Kevin Williamson, the writer who defined Scream in 1996, returned, this time as director. It marked a full-circle moment. The voice that wrote the rules was now shaping the future. Just as important was another return. Neve Campbell confirmed she reprised her role as Sidney Prescott after being absent from Scream VI. Once again, the franchise acknowledged its roots, not out of nostalgia, but necessity, because some stories refuse to stay buried. At the same time, Scream VII arrived during a moment of real-world controversy, cast departures, creative changes, public debate. For a franchise built on meta-commentary, reality began to mirror fiction. What remains clear is this: Scream VII is not about starting over. It's about consequences, what survival costs, what legacy demands, and what happens when the past refuses to let the next generation move on. If earlier films asked who gets to tell the story, Scream VII asks something more dangerous. Who gets to end it, with the original creator guiding the blade and the original final girl stepping back into frame? Scream isn't chasing relevance. It's reclaiming control. Because this franchise was never about the mask. It was about timing. Interesting trivias. The original script for Scream was titled Scary Movie, long before the parody franchise existed. The Ghostface mask was not designed for film. It was discovered by accident during location scouting and later licensed for the movie. Roger L. Jackson has voiced Ghostface in every single Scream film, maintaining continuity across decades. Drew Barrymore personally requested to be killed in the opening scene to subvert audience expectations and make the film unpredictable. Wes Craven makes a cameo in the original Scream dressed as Freddy Krueger, the character he created for Nightmare on Elm Street. Ghostface is never supernatural. Every fall, injury, and mistake is intentional to emphasize realism. Every Scream film exists in the same timeline. There are no reboots, only continuations. Scream II was partially rewritten after early drafts leaked online. Scream III is the only film with a single killer. Scream IV was Wes Craven's final directed film before his death in 2015. Neve Campbell turned down Scream VI due to a salary dispute, but later returned for Scream VII. Scream 2022 popularized the modern horror term requel. Scream VI is the first film without Sidney Prescott, and the first set outside Woodsboro. Kevin Williamson, who wrote the original Scream, returns the franchise as director for Scream VII, his first time directing an entry. The opening scene of Scream 1996 is widely regarded as one of the greatest horror openings of all time. For nearly 30 years, Scream has done something no other horror franchise has managed to sustain. It didn't outgrow its audience. It grew with it. Each era, each sequel, each new mask, all reflections of the time they were made. From a dying genre in the 1990s to a self-aware revolution to a franchise still evolving decades later. Scream didn't survive by ignoring the rules. It survived by exposing them. And as long as horror keeps changing, as long as audiences keep watching, the phone will ring again. If you enjoyed this deep dive, like the video, subscribe for more horror breakdowns and tell us in the comments, what's your favorite scary movie?